My name is Becky. I'm co-director of Agenda. We're a strategic communications agency based in the UK and in the EU. I'm delighted to be here today with Alan Clayton talking about his excellent book, Great Fundraising Organizations. Now, Alan, I met you for the very first time probably about 20 years ago. I think you were speaking at a Resource Alliance IFC event in Holland, and I can still remember the energy that you presented with. I can't remember the exact words that what you said, but I remember the energy. And I was trying to make a list of all the things that you have done over that 20-year period, and frankly, it was too long. So I should say that you are the founder and CEO of Revolutionize International, but there's more to you than that. Give us a brief sort of career history as to how you've ended up on this call today.
Well, I came from a small-minded Scottish town where if you had any kind of education, you went into the sciences. So I did. Rapidly discovered I didn't want to do the sciences. Got inspired by fundraising, graduated and retrained in fundraising. I've been doing that ever since 1993 in one form or another. So a number of years working in-house in organizations, set up my own agency, sold that 9 years later, and then embarked on the Accelerator project, and then last 12 years, the Great Fundraising Project.
So the Great Fundraising Project, excellent.
Aside from that, I also have a startup business going very, very well in mental health and well-being. But that's maybe a story for another day.
We'll have to get you on a second time to come and talk about that. So, great fundraising organizations, why and how the world's best charities excel at raising money. So you've talked about this being a long-term project, and in the beginning of the book, you do give us a little bit of insight into how the idea came about. But for those of us who haven't read it, do you want to tell us how it all happened? I think it was over a gin and tonic after National Convention or something, wasn't it?
It kind of unfolded, but that was the breakthrough moment. Through my time working for charities, through my time in the agency and then being freelance, I came to the conclusion that raising money is actually quite simple. You make sure you have the best possible product, you have the best possible communications, you go out and you sell it really well, and then you treat people brilliantly and look after them for the rest of their life. 4 things. Very, very straightforward. Why was it so bloody hard? And that was what we decided to study. How can it be so hard to save a child, which I think is the opening study in the book. I remember it vividly from 30 years ago. What on earth is getting in the way of something that is so wonderful and so simple? And we very quickly, just through experimentation and doing some seminars with clients of mine, came to the conclusion that it was almost entirely behavioral, but the behavioral requirements went far beyond the fundraiser or the fundraising department and deep into the rest of the organization, including its leadership. And we kind of concluded that, but we couldn't evidence it in any way. And then I had a gin and tonic with Professor Sargent, and he said, cheekily, any interest in getting that researched? If I'd known how much we were going to spend on research over the next 10 years, I'm not sure I would have perhaps signed off on that initial proposal, but in hindsight, I'm extremely glad that we did. So, you know, the first few stages is evidencing the difference between those that grow and those that don't. And then the next rounds of research were all about, well, how on earth do you do that? And then finally, how on earth do you start it? Yeah. So.
And how were you doing the research? Had you signed up a certain number of charities that you were using to kind of benchmark things against? Like, what was the process?
It was a complete punt. Adrian gave us a ballpark price and a ballpark process, and I said, go for it, I'll find the money. And then we looked for the initial, so this is right back at the beginning. There's a queue for organizations to be researched now, as you can imagine. But right at the beginning, we identified couplets of organizations, ones that had been very effective and ones that hadn't. And we made sure those couplets were trying to fundraise for the same mission in the same market. So they were to some extent controlled. You know, the NSPCC, of course, was one, and another national children's charity that was bringing in 10% of what NSPCC did was another. And so we research the two and do a gap analysis. What's one doing that the other isn't? And there were some immediate, stark and measurable differences. And that's what gave us the confidence to then plow on and do it. And really counterintuitive differences that
like
framed everything else that follows. The biggest one, the moment we realized we were into a different realm here was something we call the impossible dream. Because up until then, or until Ken Burnett and I started going on about emotional fundraising, we'd had 10 years of being taught that impact and impact measurement was everything, and that organizational credibility drove growth. And the first research said nonsense to those two, in that it was an impossible dream that drove growth, a big idea that we're never ever going to achieve, which of course is incredible promise. It's the opposite of credible. So that was probably the first insight that went, oh wow, the most successful organizations, big or small, are doing something dramatically different to the rest. And quite frankly, dramatically different to what we're being taught to do at conferences. That was a sample of 24 organizations, so that's not nearly big enough to conclude or publish on. So we then repeated that research in half a dozen other countries until it got to be pointless spending any more on research because it was exactly the same everywhere. So that was probably the first insight, which really is, it's the primacy of emotion and belief in terms of making stuff happen. And what we were being taught was not how to drive growth, it's how to overcome objections. Yeah. So we're starting off with a negative hypothesis that we can't persuade people to give. Let's look at the reasons they don't and try and overcome those, rather than doing that. So you can actually follow that in straight lines through the research, all to the two businesses, one mission insight, and critically to the have a better product insight. What is a better product? And it all, really that very first insight, the primacy of emotion, was probably the one that set everything else off in train.
Can you give us an example of an impossible dream and where that played out within an organization?
Oh yeah, if I could open my SharePoint, I could show you 200 of them now. I'll talk about the original one first, because it was very controversial at the time, but it did make more than 500 million quid, which was cruelty to children should stop, full stop. Yeah, and that goes right through to RNLI 3 years ago to Save Everyone, International Justice Mission in the US, the campaign to end slavery, and so on and so forth. These are the biggest organizations. Let's think about a smaller local one, children's hospices across Scotland, keep the joy alive even in the face of death. They all have these impossible dreams, and you always get to the same place. It's the argument between credibility and then belief and trust. So the anecdote at NSPCC was the same as the anecdote at RNLI. They said, well, we've got to be a credible organization. We can never end cruelty to children, so surely we must publicize something credible. So the chairman puts a group in the room and says, okay, give us a target. How much should we reduce child cruelty by? And people start getting really, really angry. And you say, well, actually, what we're doing is we're setting a target for the right level of child abuse. We can't do that. There's no acceptable level. The chairman going, that's what I thought we just said. Yeah, same at RNLI. We'll never save everyone. Yeah, but that's why we need more money. That's the fundraising case. Yeah, we need to be credible. So they moved from we need to reduce the number of preventable drownings in and around the waters of the United Kingdom by 50% gradually over a 10-year horizon, being the vision, shifting it to save everyone. We can't save everyone. Yeah, that's why we need more money. It just over and over and over again. So I'm trying to pick familiar ones for the majority of the audience, but it goes everywhere. So let's just go to Argentina, and it just came to the top of my mind, UNICEF Argentina. So the impossible dream is trying to solve one of the world's biggest problems, or the biggest problems in your market. People are generally hesitate to say it because of credibility and the fear of criticism. So go to UNICEF in Argentina, they cannot say child poverty is rife in Argentina because the government funds some of their projects in Argentina. So what is the impossible dream? Well, it turns out what you can do is name the problem as being decades of financial mismanagement has put Argentina as being one of the poorest countries in the world when it used to be one of the richest. So instead of blaming the government, what you do is you blame the previous 100 years of government, and that makes the current government very happy. So you then rephrase it as being, let's get the generation that gets our children out of danger. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's the impossible dream with a lot of nuance to get your organization lined up behind it with no fear. That's a long way of saying it.
Excellent. I love that. So we've talked about the impossible dream. What are the other sort of qualities and requirements to be a really great fundraising organization?
Okay, it's the ability to have a high-performing, focused fundraising team with a brilliant product and get all the other crap out of the way. That's the next prime ability. Yeah. So this is the two businesses. This is the two businesses, one mission model. One business is always an academic culture or a medical culture or a scientific culture or a public sector culture or social work or a development culture. They have to have a massive bureaucracy there. Bureaucracy with a small b is not critical. They have to have it because if they make mistakes, they kill people, yeah, or they waste other people's money. So you generally have this slow-moving, iterative, heavily regulated environment to save children's lives or feed people or do medical research, as it should be. On the other hand, you have a fundraising department, which is a fast-moving consumer goods business. It just is. But if you take a fast-moving consumer goods business and you slap on it the same bureaucracy that you slap on top of the rest of the organization, you stifle it. You stop it working. They spend less time asking for money and more time managing processes, debates, opinions, protocol, etc. And there's also the assumption that you're one organization with one product, and that's not true either, because the services side of the business is selling the solution. Fundraising is actually selling the problem. So they're not only different products, but they're the opposite to each other. So that bakes in all kinds of conflict into a fundraising organization, which can then be unpicked and dealt with layer by layer by layer. So accepting that you actually have two businesses within one governance framework and then freeing up the fast-moving money-earning business to behave like a fast-moving money-earning business is the next key point. So have a better product, starting with the impossible dream and working down, and then freeing the team up to, or the individual even, to go after it at pace.
Is there something also about culture and understanding of fundraising and how it works? I know you speak about ethical intellectual culture. And I don't know, in my own experience of working as a fundraiser, there was definitely an element of snobbery around it. We were kind of like, we were the dirty capitalists. And actually in communications as well, the same thing happens. The comms people are quite often the fluffy people, sprinkling glitter on things. And they don't often think of us as being as strategic as we actually are. Talk to me about that. What is this ethical intellectual culture?
This actually echoes all the rest of the world, really, because, go and work for an engineering firm. There'll be 500 engineers who have qualifications and degrees and master's degrees and PhDs, and they're all really clever. And then the salesperson, maybe has a bachelor's degree, unlikely to be much more than that. They're often the least educated person in the company, but they are quite often the highest paid, because they're quite simply doing the one thing that nobody else wants to do, which is the sales job. This is just exaggerated in the voluntary sector. So you have the two businesses. You have to have an ethical intellectual culture to run the services department of any charity. Yeah, you have to have it. It's great. They have to be ethical and they have to be intellectual. Super. Absolutely there. And fundraisers need to be an ambitious achiever culture. They need to be focused. They need to be intuitively sales and marketing people. And they need to move at that pace. The problem is that those two different cultures do not generally understand each other or particularly get on with each other. They wouldn't choose to hang out in the pub as social mates because they're really very, very different. Whereas in the engineering firm, the roles are seriously demarcated in general. It's less so in a charity. Two things, really. One is that in order to have the best fundraising product, we are entirely reliant on the input from the services department. And what we typically see is services departments think that donors shouldn't want what donors want. They think they should want something else because they're more clever than donors are. So they say, well, your job is to educate the donors to understand what we do. I say, no, my job is to interpret your stuff so my donors can understand it. Yeah, it's not the same thing at all. And then, of course, the powers that be at the organization, they want integrated communications. So you're going to have to try and take one ethical intellectual set of communications communicating the solution and one simple emotional set of communications communicating the problem, and you try to integrate them. Welcome to communications hell. And I know you've lived there quite a lot, Becky. So, you know, the cultures are necessary, and both are admirable. Both are wonderful, but they are very, very different.
How do you deal with that inside an organization? What are some of the tips you might offer the ethical intellectuals and also the fundraisers? How to get on well together?
It starts with mutual respect. If you don't have that, then you're stuffed. If the fundraisers don't respect that you need complex academic intellectuals to deliver services, then you've got a problem. And if the complex intellectuals delivering services don't respect the fact that you need sales and marketing people to bring the money in, then you've got a problem. So the way we describe it is actually to be a fast growing fundraising organization, you need to have a culture that respects the donor as much as it respects the service user. Yeah. And unless you have that respect, you're not going to move forward. So that's stage one.
I've got absolutely tons of questions. It was a really excellent book, and there was loads where I was like, oh, that's I need to ask more about that. But for the benefit of the audience, particularly those who might not have read the book, you talk about a red dot moment.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us what that is and why it's so important and how other people can create one within their own organizations?
Okay, so the red dot moment is the start of a surge in fundraising income, the start of a period of growth. We started looking for it when we looked through the data, the historical data, and found that no organization had grown their fundraising in a straight line. It was always a surge of growth, and then it would go wrong for a bit or backwards. And then, so we looked at what caused this, and we found that the moment the organization shifted from decline to growth or from flatline to growth, that you could identify a single board meeting that triggered that. And that was what we call the red dot moment. I'm afraid there's no science behind the red dots and blue dots. It's just an accident of history that when we were doing the analysis with the researchers, I only had two Sharpie pens. One was red and one was blue. So sorry, there's just it's just entered it's entered the fundraising lexicon, and I can't give it any more magic than that. So it's the board meeting where a new fundraising strategy is signed off. That's the boring description. But what leads up to it is immense, because the good boards are looking at the fundraising function not from a governance perspective, but from an investor perspective. Yeah. So they transcend their governance role, their essential and vital governance role, and they choose to view income growth from an investor perspective. So they have spent some time coming to believe in the product, the idea, the impossible dream, and everything that comes from it. Second, they've come to believe the financial plan and their ability to monitor and risk manage it. And third, they believe in the people, which is the ability of the people, but also that the whole organization is culturally behind the big idea. So they're examining those three things. And until they've got those three, no sensible board will have the confidence to hit that button and make the commitments required to drive growth. And we call it as investors because it was very obvious in a couple of the bigger organizations where there were people skilled in investment on the board. The minute we explained these three things to them, they went, it's just the same as investing at the bank or at my business. That's the three things we look at. And if you look at Dragon's Den, that's the only three things they look at. And if you look at the failures on Dragon's Den, they think the idea will get the money. If you look at the successes, they realize it's the idea, the money, and the people. So you have to get all three of them lined up. So it's typically, for an organization that's really been struggling, it takes 12 months even to reach that board meeting, because the amount of education, development, and then diligence required to get to that moment of commitment is surprisingly huge.
So imagine that you're a fundraising director of a medium-sized organization and you really want to grow, and they've read your book and they're like, right, I've got to create this red dot moment. Like, what do they do? How do they engage their senior leadership team and the board in order to start thinking like this?
I have a bit of data on this.
Oh, excellent. That's what I like. Get ready for it.
For middle-sized organizations, it's not the same for very big ones. For middle-sized organizations. For every middle-sized organization that we
Sorry, just to interrupt, can you define middle-sized just for the benefit of the room?
No, because it's across multiple countries and it would take me decades.
Fine. So there's no kind of like, we're not talking like an income, we're not talking a particular size of income.
In every country, there's a small number of like highly established, very big organizations, normally the big international INGOs plus one or two local ones. It's the level below those. So it's above the single fundraiser, but it's not the fundraising factory. Yeah.
Got you. Yeah.
For every one of those, there's a critical success factor. So every time the chief executive has engaged, the client has succeeded. Every time the chief executive has not engaged, the client has failed. We can bring it down to a single point of success or failure.
So it's all down to leadership.
Get the CEO on board. And, you know, we've done seminars for fundraisers who've said the only objective of this is to get the CEO on board, but I need to put 12 people in a room for a day to do it. Okay, if that's what it takes, that's what we'll do. And of course, that can be difficult because most CEOs come up through a service delivery background, so they're from the bureaucratic, ethical, intellectual culture. They didn't get into charity to be fundraisers. Yeah, so it's they have to realize that actually they would increase their impact on the mission by being open enough to learning about how to earn money as well as how to spend it well. So there's an open-mindedness and humility and a mission drive in the CEO that's required, and that matches all the research that says level 5 leadership is absolutely key. Once you've got the CEO, 9 times out of 10, the board follow eventually. Takes some time, assuming the CEO stays long enough. But yeah, so it seems to us that if you, so I just seen in the comment, yeah, I'm defining it by fundraising team size rather than income because that cuts out my problem of international boundaries. That's a good insight. There's a sort of, I can't evidence this next bit, but it seems to be what happens. For a CEO to really pay attention, it takes more than one management team member to approach them. If it's just the fundraiser, they're used to that. So if the fundraiser can get together with the finance director and then go and see the CEO, you're going to succeed. If the fundraiser can get together with head of programs, you're probably going to succeed. If the fundraiser can get together with HR, you're probably going to succeed. So it's often a bit of sideways management and then go to the CEO. And then if you end up with programs, fundraising and finance plus CEO, it's a very silly board that will then overrule that leadership team. And I can't remember seeing that happen, as long as they really know what they're doing and it's not just opinion. Yeah.
Kat Arnold is asking, what if your CEO is the fundraiser? Is this something that, you know, how would you apply this to small organizations where there isn't a fundraiser?
If you are the CEO of a very small organization, you're the top salesperson. Simple as that. It's not even marketing or fundraising, really. It's getting out there and selling it. You know, I wish there was a more intellectual way of putting that. But Becky, you've run small business for years. I've run small businesses for years. The minute I give up on selling and promoting the business, it's going to disappear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same with you. And that's the same with being the CEO. I'm sorry, I can't give you any more intellectual insight than that. But if you want to increase your impact as a small charity, then your 1, 2, or 3 members of staff need to put as much effort into to sales and fundraising as you do into delivering service. It's just that, just that simple.
I want to ask some questions about finance, and then I'm going to open it up to the room. So people get ready with your questions. I'll ask for a show of hands in a second. But in the book, you talk about how organisations that stagnate base their investment plans on budgetary needs. Great fundraising organisations base it on financial aspirations.
Yeah.
Talk us through that, and in particular, can you address the fact that, I mean, with Kat and being a CEO of a small organization, you need to have money to make money, right? So how do you kind of like address this need for having some capital there in the first place?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've got to understand that what we've studied is organizations that employ career fundraisers. We have not studied the one-man bands. I believe that a lot of the lessons can be taken and applied, you know, to very, very tiny organizations, but they weren't who we set out to study. So you know, that's a big caveat. Yeah, you need to invest money to grow anything. You can get that from all kinds of different sources. It's a slightly different question, and you can be very creative about how you do that. But we can come back to that. Your question's about the financial structure. Yeah. So every single charity we've ever come across reports its finances on an annual basis. Yep. Because it has to do that for the authorities. That's what the regulators demand. And the definition of good governance is what you do between year 1 of the financial year and day 365 of the financial year, and how you promote it. It's useful for humans. A year is a good time to be producing that kind of stuff. And that is a great timescale for governance. Yep. It is about as much use as an ashtray on a motorbike for driving growth. Yep. It's useless for driving growth. What's more use for driving growth is a 5, 7, 10-year period in terms of planning your aspiration and your marginal gains and your acceleration. And in terms of driving short-term results, which of course all add up to the long-term growth, a year is far too long. 90 days is about right, a quarterly action plan. So the fact that we account annually, and that's the only accounting procedure that we can use, would be absolutely stifling to fundraising growth. So what the very best do, they do the governance brilliantly. I'm not dissing governance in any way. It's very important. It needs to be done. But the board or the chief exec or the management team would move from governance to growth mindset. And we have some clients who actually do 2 hours of governance in their board meeting, have lunch, and come back and do 2 hours of growth. They separate it so they can change their mood, if you like, in between 1 and the 2. And they look at a completely different set of metrics. So they look at how are we on track towards our 5, 7 year goal, 5, 7, 10-year goal. And then they look at the minuscule data of the last 90 days and saying, what do we need to move around to make sure we're ahead of track for that goal? So on that model, the key measure is not actually how much came in this financial year. The key measure is what is our lifetime value divided by cost per new donor looking like. And that applies to everything: corporate, legacies, individual giving, community. Because that operates over a much longer term than the 1 year. So it's a difference in timescales, but it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, again, there's a lot of parallels to business. If you or I were to run our small businesses based on everything we spend has to have a return this year, we'd be dead. We'd never employ anybody. You know, it takes me a year to get a consultant up to speed.
Exactly. Right. Can I have a show of hands from people who want to ask questions, please?
I've got a question here from David Berlin. Do you mind if I respond to that?
No, of course. Yeah. Do you want to read it out and then respond?
Would you agree that those CEOs from a service background who get fundraising often actually become more effective advocates and leaders from an income generation perspective than those from a fundraising background? I wouldn't agree with that, but I agree with the sentiment behind that question. Yeah. that some from a fundraising background are spectacularly good at this. I don't think there's any difference in there. What I will do is put a layer on top of your question in terms of what we've got from the deep case study evidence, is if you have someone from a services background who then becomes CEO and then gets fundraising and understands it, what then happens is they get a whole new personal ambition, because they've kind of reached the top of the tree by being CEO coming from the services background, and then they discover the other business and they get refreshed and rejuvenated as people, because there's a whole new thing for them to aim at, multiplying the size of the service reach by 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 and whatever. And those people that get that combination of both have been absolutely the most effective I've ever had the privilege to work with.
Super, thank you. David, are you waving again? Do you want to turn your
yeah, I think Alan's actually agreeing with me based on what he just said. But anyway, I just very quickly, my background is in the hospice sector, where you get that clash in a building 24/7 at times, so it can be quite challenging. But I've seen, and I could, one name's come to mind, just what Alan said, someone who came from a clinical background and got it, and I think I could see the redrive in personality. But I also think because they've got that direct experience on the service side, they can bring that alive in a way that perhaps is harder for someone with a fundraising background who hasn't got that direct experience. So I guess that's what I'm reflecting on. Thanks anyway.
Okay. I'll agree within the context of working with trusts, major donors, etc., where that detailed knowledge is required. When it comes to the more marketing side of fundraising, the one with a fundraising background would generally outperform. I think that's a level of detail below what we're actually talking about, I think.
Thanks anyway. Great. Cheers.
Anybody else got questions? You're going to have to use your, I can't see everybody, so if you can use the reactions button on Zoom, give me an indication of who wants to ask a question. Anybody? Okay, don't be shy. Oh, Damien Chapman. Hi, Damien. Damien is saying, I think you know Damien, Alan. He's saying, what, if anything, surprised you most? I'm assuming, so Damien, that you're
I'm so tempted to say the board of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising at this point. But I had the pleasure of seeing them in seminar for 3 days, and it was really quite wonderful. Yeah, I don't think this is a particularly helpful answer, but what surprised me most was how much influence people who are completely ignorant of fundraising held over its major decisions at charities all over the world. I was stunned.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I can relate.
I've got nothing to add to that.
Yep.
we talk about the guy who used to market milk, who was there for an expert on fundraising for Save the Cows. Yeah.
Nora, you've got your hand up. What's your question, please?
Hi, thank you for that. I was wondering about unpicking the point you made around getting a CEO on board with fundraising, and whether there's any advice or thinking behind having a new CEO come on board, and how you might influence them to focus on fundraising. I suppose particularly if you've got a team who are doing well.
Yeah.
But because my feeling is we may get a new CEO who looks at fundraising and goes, they've got that sorted, I don't need to get involved.
Okay. There is a very simple answer to that, which is to try and raise the ambition.
Yeah.
Now, this doesn't work for everybody, so it's not successful 100% of the time, but every time it has worked, it's been extremely successful. So you quite simply ask a question, which is as relevant to the board as it is to the CEO, which is, how would you like the world to be different after you finished your tenure than it was when you started? Not what you want to do or what's your strategy. How do you want the world to be different when you finish? And if they say, that's a long conversation for a lot of people. But what you find quite quickly is people are tempering their ambitions because they don't believe a lot more money will be available. So you then end up in that loop of, well, if we have the ambition, we'll get the money. Yeah. If we have the money, we'll fulfill the ambition. So you then get that symbiotic relationship between the fundraiser and the chief exec going really quite early. But in order to do that, you need to get them away from the 1 year governance thinking, like quite quickly, and into the length of their tenure. You know, hopefully they'll stay for a minimum of 5 years if they're a decent CEO, and that's enough time to change the world. We love it now because we've been working with some clients long enough for them to be on to the next chief executive. What most of them do now is when they're recruiting their successor, they put mandatory attendance at one of our master classes into their inductions. So we're generally really happy about it. So they pass it, they do it as they recruit people, say you will be getting the best fundraising training that we will provide, because that's a key part of the role and it's baked in.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nora. I mean, I generally feel that everybody in every organisation should have fundraising and comms training as part of their induction. I think it's so important. Right, so how to find the balance? Marcy is asking, how to find the balance between the impossible problem with the local audience. For example, we want to end violence against women and girls, but our current reach is a local region.
Simple answer: stories, stories, and more stories. Fundraising is driven by the big dream. Growth is driven by the big dream, but communications are always driven by the single story. And if you have a problem and solution hierarchy, your biggest problem driving your biggest dream, underneath that, there will be subsidiary layers of problems which always end up with the story of an individual. So with diligence, the clear link between the impossible dream and the story of every individual is clear. And if you can manage that in your communications, you're bulletproof. So simple answer, Marcia: storytelling, authentic stories. But, and there's always a but, you do need two kinds of stories. You need the stories of the people you've helped and the stories of the people, sorry, that you can't help yet because you don't have enough money. It's called the sliding door story.
Do you want to expand? You talk about that quite a lot in the book. Do you want to expand on that a bit further?
Yeah. You know, if you go back to the opening thing about two businesses, one mission, and people assuming that organizational credibility is why we give us money, what we do is we put lots of success stories out there. We've saved this many lives, we've done this many operations, etc., etc. So what you're actually doing is broadcasting reasons why you don't need any money yet. It's always helpful to use a real life example. So RNLI, I think we all know because they've published it, had a rocky time a few years ago. And at the time, they were under instruction to tell everybody how brave they were and how many lives they saved. So that's like just basically a whole brand PR campaign about why we don't need any more money. The big shift happened when we were doing some communications work with them on to save everyone. And the reason we need more money is because people are still dying. People are still drowning. And then working with the actual volunteers on the boats, the real, you know, the front line of RNLI, they hated talking about who they've saved and how brave they were. And I remember just saying, well, would you prefer to tell the story of the one you couldn't save? And that became the campaign, because that's what the whole organization actually wanted to talk about, because they're all terrified that they might go out on a rescue and not rescue the person. And that's the reason they need faster boats and better kit and better training and more money, is the one we couldn't save. And when RNLI freed themselves up to talk about the one I couldn't save, income just boomed. And interestingly, so did internal morale and satisfaction and alignment and such like. People often say we don't have any stories of the one we couldn't save. And I said, you do. You just don't find them in your beneficiary book. You find them in your donor book, because there'll be people who are giving you money because their story or the story of somebody they knew did not have such a good ending. And that's why they're giving. So those stories are out there.
I can imagine that can also be quite good for the mental well-being of a team as well, because I know a lot of people who work within charities put a lot of pressure on themselves to save everybody, and then can become very upset when they don't. So I guess framing it in that way would help with the morale, and I mean, you've said morale, but also sort of your mental health as you go too.
Yeah, I could comment more on the mental health of fundraisers, because we've measured that and studied that in great detail. We have studied it in service departments, but nowhere near as thoroughly as we have in fundraising teams. The two things fundraisers need more than anything for their mental health, it's not really to do with workload. On a statistical scale, it might be on the occasional individual. But on a statistical scale, it's two things. It's being connected with a purpose. The bigger ideal of what we're doing. When your job just becomes about the quarterly budget, the monthly report, and the annual budget, you take all the well-being out of it, because that's only really ever a negative motivator. And the second one is respect of non-fundraising colleagues. They're the two biggest drains on fundraisers' well-being, and that's by a long way. It's not even close. But you're absolutely right in that one of the biggest sources of disrespect is all the non-fundraisers being an expert on how fundraisers should communicate. Yeah, everybody knows how to communicate for fundraising. Once they respect the fact that we have to talk about the stories with the bad ending and the good ending to show the difference a gift is going to make, then the well-being is transformed. So you're absolutely right, but there's a sort of stepped nuance to why it's so good for well-being.
Just sticking on comms for a moment, and then I'll come back to the questions in the chat. But you mentioned obviously quite rightly a lot about audience. Any person on here who's a comms professional and indeed a fundraiser will know that audience is absolutely key. It's not about you, it's about them. And you gave a really nice example from Trocaire, who started off with the strapline, the fight for justice, and then you changed it until love conquers fear. Can you tell us about that? Because I thought that was a really nice story about framing.
It's happened a number of times since. So in that example, you have a Christian audience and a Christian organization, but a services department that have learned human rights language. So they're trying to use human rights language to join the fight for justice in order to convince tens of thousands of slightly older Catholic women to give them money, whereas the slightly older Catholic women don't speak the human rights view of making the world a better place. They speak the church view of having a different place. So my favorite takeaway from that at Trocaire was the head of programs after 3 days said, "I'm very embarrassed. I spent 10 years trying to teach the population of Ireland my language, whereas actually all I needed to do was learn theirs."
Nice.
And that's it in a nutshell. And we've seen that time and time again.
Thank you. That was excellent. So there's a couple of questions in here. One from me apparently, but I suspect that might be my business partner Vic, and then also Sarah. And I think they're effectively asking the same thing. It's around having different sets of messaging and how to avoid any kind of conflict or contradiction in that messaging, particularly if your audience is, you might have some that are campaigners and are interested in the information side of it and the services, but are also donating. How do you make sure that you're not sending mixed messages out?
You are sending mixed messages out, and there's no way of avoiding it. But then the only worry, so it's two different messages to two identifiably and targetable markets. The only worry then can be interference. What happens if the same person sees the same messages? So we measured that. Do you know what happens when the same person sees the two different messages? They don't even notice.
Fascinating.
Yeah, they don't even realize it's two different messages. It's a false worry, according to the data. Yeah. So
this is where the benefit of evidence-based communications comes in, right? Is that knowing that
you need the data and you need the stories. When you need both. I'm good at the second half of the question that someone else has written for you is interesting. Have you examples of when comms has contributed to crafting a unifying narrative? Yes, I do. Many of them, and perhaps this is impossible to explain in a book because it involves waving my hands around. But you have these two businesses, and generally, and particularly the smaller organizations, you have the chief exec very hands-on with both. So what often happens is the chief exec or the leadership team get fed up with these two businesses constantly arguing about how we should communicate. And because they don't know the solution, they try to find someone that does. So they recruit a comms professional or a high-class comms agency. In the bad organizations, what they do is they don't give them a brief. They just put them in the middle of the two and say, your job is to get the two of those to agree. Yeah. If you have that brief, you can't win. Because the only way you can win is to compromise. And to do that, you're going to ruin both sets of communications. Yeah. In the really bad organizations, what those people do is realize that they can't win. So in the absence of connection, they seek power. So what they do in between the two companies, they push themselves in the hierarchy above it, and you get the situation where brand is boss and tells everybody what to do. And that has one effect: it kills your fundraising stone dead. Yeah. In the successful organizations where the leadership understand, they put the comms agency or the comms person in and say, your job is to take the unifying big idea and make that work for both services and fundraising, so that they have the same tone of voice, they have the same personality, but they are delivering different products to different audiences. So looping back to the actual question, it's the ability, the comms, rather than starting in the detail of how are we going to police it, is how are we going to find that point of unification? What's the common problem, solution, and ambition that both services and fundraising can completely buy into with enthusiasm? And I've seen that succeed on many an occasion, whoever the real Becky Slack is.
I suspect it's Vic. Have you got can you give us one of those examples? Is there an organization that you can tell us about?
Let me just open up my case study library for inspiration. I know hundreds. I'm just trying to find you a very, very good one.
While Alan's doing that, are there any more questions? Can I have another show?
Actually, I will. I'll talk about one that launched yesterday.
Okay.
And it's Make-A-Wish Canada.
Right.
Yeah. This is it's a public domain yesterday. I've just posted about it on LinkedIn today. So Make-A-Wish globally was stymied for many years by global brand policy that says you're only allowed to publish positive images of children enjoying our trips to Disneyland or whatever, our wishes. Hanneke, the CEO in the Netherlands, broke the mold, identified the problem, spoke about it, and multiplied her income by 10. So the rest of the world took notice. Yep. Canada's the second biggest Make-A-Wish in the world, so they were one of the big pioneers of this. So you start working on problem hierarchy, solution hierarchy. What's the big idea? It's iterative process. And we got to a moment where it said, granting a wish to a child will definitely improve the family's mental health, and it may even improve their medical outcomes. Yeah, it might. And I stopped and said, what does might mean? And they said, well, we believe it does, but we can't prove it, so we can't put that in our fundraising. And I remember saying, right, you've got two choices then. You can either say we can't prove it, so therefore our fundraising's got to suffer because we've got to claim something of lesser importance, or you can prove it. And there was silence in the room. And the chief executive said, that's a hell of a point. We believe it's true. The stories say it's true. We just don't have the data. If we can get that data, then we can say to donors that your gift will make a sick child better. And the team all looked horrified. The chief executive turned around and said, however long it takes, prove that. Because if we can't prove that, I doubt we have a reason to exist. It was a very powerful moment. Yeah. So they had the stories, but not the data. It will come as no surprise over a period of 9 months, they got the data. Yeah.
Yeah. So that comes back to what you were saying earlier about impact measurement. Like the impossible dream, yes, but actually you do also still need that impact measurement in order to be able to.
You need the data and the stories. Yeah, you absolutely need both to back it up. Mm-hmm. So what they suddenly had, and this was driven by comms, this was driven by nobody else, was they then had the story evidence and they then have the data evidence. and they were unified for the first time ever. So they have just relaunched their new position, which is Wish is Our Medicine, that launched yesterday. And in the build up, income has rocketed. But that's one of the yeah. Thanks, Deborah. Is that the same Deborah Benson?
It is the same Deborah Benson. Yeah.
That long time no see. And this is just, it's, look at the case study, brand new, published yesterday. Yeah, I remember Deborah. Good to see you. Sorry, I had a blast from the past. Yeah, so that is one of the best examples, because that was comms led and actually led to changes in the programmatic department because of what comms needed in order to be an awesome fundraising organization. They're going to raise billions on the back of that. I know the team that are executing it now. It's astonishing. I'm so sorry. I see other people that are hand up. I will stop talking.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm just going to ask a very quick question, and then I'll come back to the audience. That was, you mentioned the dreaded C word, which is compromise. Yeah. And we recently worked with an organization where they wanted to change their name, and due to compromise and also a certain healthy amount of misogyny, rather than end up with one name, they ended up with three. And no amount of persuasion or evidence would persuade them that this was not a very good idea. And I just wonder if you've got any tips for dealing with those moments where where compromise is just absolutely dreadful, and how do you persuade them not to do that?
I can. I've got a very good tip for this, which is a classic example of simple is not easy. Okay, so it's quite easy to show people that if they compromise, they will damage their income and therefore the number of people they can help. The data can show that. What then stops people doing it is fear. And it's fear of one thing and one thing only. It's fear of criticism. It's fear of being criticized in the media, by your service users, by your donors, or worst of all, by your own staff. So people compromise in order to avoid criticism. Yeah, full stop. So what you do is you say to people is you say, what we're going to do is tell the truth well, and we're going to accept that if we do that, some people are going to criticize us. Yeah, it's an uncomfortable truth. That's what drives fundraising. Children are being abused. That's what drives fundraising, an uncomfortable truth. So instead of putting our energy into how we're going to compromise to avoid criticism, let's put our energy into how we're going to react when we are criticized. Yeah. I'll choose the RNLI again, because this was the highest profile example of this ever. Do you remember when the RNLI were criticized for saving people's lives in the channel?
I do.
Yeah. Do you remember how RNLI reacted?
I do. Do you want to tell everybody, in case there's people on the call who don't remember?
That was no accident. Yeah, they were prepared for that because they knew the criticism would come, so they knew how they were going to react. The RNLI were criticized for rescuing drowning families and migrants in the English Channel and bringing them to the south coast of England. And some politicians and some media called for people to stop giving them donations because they were operating as a migrant taxi service. I was in the conversation about how we would react, which we did within the hour. And I said, what's our purpose? Is to save everyone. Are we embarrassed about that? We're proud of it. We're proud of it. Right. This is how we're going to respond. We're going to put it on the front page of our website. And we're going to say, we are going to try and rescue everybody we can in the channel. We're proud of that work. Our only regret is that we cannot as yet save them all. What that did for the organization, the public, was extraordinary. Right enough. About 200 people cancelled their giving, but about 16,000 made their first ever gift. So it was a great example of we're not compromising. Absolutely not. We believe in this. And they were prepared for it. Yeah, Nora, they bossed it. They absolutely did. It was so heartfelt and real and meant from all the volunteers, from everybody from on the boats to on the phones and all the staff. It was remarkable.
And that actually reminds me that on the 17th of September, this time next week, I am actually doing a workshop on crisis comms and how to prepare for criticism like that. So if anybody would like to come along, then please let me know.
So Becky, do you have the line? I'll give you a great line for this, which is, when you are criticized, purpose is boss. Yeah.
Nice. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna use that in my
Okay.
in my presentation next
Okay.
week. Thank you very much.
It makes all the decisions for you.
Sarah, you had your hand up. I'm going to come to you.
Thank you, Alan, for the book, which I really enjoyed. I live in the same village as Ken, so I will see him probably this evening.
You say
It's
hello
a really small world.
to
I said the first part, I think you answered about different kinds of materials and approaches depending on the audience. So, and I see this a lot, as you said, the ethical and intellectual about a service, and we're a mental health organization, and then the kind of fundraising piece, which is much more around addressing a particular need or kind of, it's just different. I was interested in the extent to which you talk about corporate donors being motivated emotionally as well as, because that's quite important to us at the moment as we develop relationships with different companies, is trying to think about how we approach that, not just the where they're giving out big grants from a philanthropic point of view, but also where it's kind of individual giving through a campaign with a company. So just be interested a bit more about what you thought about that.
Yeah, we did get this research. There was a group of clients very successful in corporate fundraising, took that hypothesis and went out and checked it. And it ranges from really quite small to global. UNICEF did it. And it's quite clear that what happens in corporates is the decision making is done by humans. So sometimes it can be a director that wants to champion a particular cause, or it can be the staff get more fired up by one thing than another. Of course, one then needs to justify that decision internally on a corporate basis. So there is always a lot that follows it. One can be a bit jokey about it and say that a lot of it is post ad hoc rationalization, which sometimes it is. And sometimes you do need to make a business case to back up the emotional wishes of the people that want to do it. The kind of shortcut we use to explain to people is fundamentally emotional is why people do things, and logic is why they don't do silly things. So the reason someone would choose a particular partner at corporate is pretty much always emotional. Particularly as ultimately their aim is to engage one of two stakeholder groups. It's either their customers or their staff or both. And they need that emotional engagement to engage those two groups. But they're also not going to do something that's going to cost them a lot of money or damage their reputation. So there will always be a logical follow-up to make sure it aligns with the business. But the driver is still emotional, for sure. That was a fairly big bit of work.
Super, thank you. I see that Nora's put a question in the chat, and I'm going to ask this and then also ask you a closing question as well. So Nora's asked, how does the economic lack narrative, cost of living crisis we've seen recently in the media influence the big impossible dream approach? And we've only got a couple of minutes left. So if you could also, within that, sort of, if there's one key takeaway that you want people to take away from today about what it is to be a great fundraising organization, what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I will. I'll give it the absolute start of it. So in answer to Nora's question, the data says it doesn't affect it at all. I have a belief on top of it that actually it makes the need for the big impossible dream greater with people, although I've no way of evidencing that at the moment. But if we take psychographic changes in a population and look at fundraising performance through economic turbulence or periods of lack narrative, we can put together a correlation. I'm not yet saying it's cause and effect, but that says that the harder time people are having, the more they need something greater than themselves to join in with. And I believe that's why we see fundraising as being pretty much recession proof, which the data says it is. So actually, the harder time you're having, the more likely you are to try and do something good and big. It's definitely a correlation. It's out of scope for us to spend money on proving it, but it's a correlation we can definitely see. And the answer to your question, Becky, is one word: confidence. If you are 100% confident you go out to raise money, you will get it. Confidence comes from two things, which are clarity and certainty. clarity plus certainty equals confidence. And clarity and certainty come from the precise definition of the problem you are trying to solve in a way that you are able to communicate it. The vast majority of organizations are too amorphous, too vague, too compromised about describing that problem. And it's not always the obvious. So what problem is a children's hospice trying to solve? It's not going to save the life of the child. Yeah, it's they don't want the joy to die with the child. That's the insight. 2.5 days to realize that, but they've raised tens of millions on the back of it. And the other example would be, someone mentioned mental health. It is entirely unacceptable to go out and talk about the tragedy and scandal of suicide in public, because you will create copycat suicides. And everyone knows that suicide's really shitey anyway, so we don't need to do that. So what you need to do is identify what's the problem that you're solving. Well, from some organizations, it's when people find themselves overwhelmed and alone. So the solution is a person. For other organizations, it's the congregation of circumstances in our society that allow a person to reach a position of being overwhelmed and alone. And then you're talking about a more complex set of solutions. And finding your unique place starts with that question: what problem are we trying to solve? And it's much harder to identify that than most people ever realize. But once you have it, you have certainty and clarity, and that equals confidence. And when you have that, the money will come.
Thank you. So remembering what problem you are trying to solve. And I hope that for everybody here, we have helped solve some of your problems in fundraising and communications. I would like you all to give a big cheer and round of applause to Alan. And thank you very much for your time, Alan. It was super insightful, and it's been a real pleasure chatting with you again after all these years. Lots of love from the room. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. Really appreciate it. Alan, if they don't already have a copy of your book and they want to buy it, where can they get it from?
The best thing to do is go to our website, revolutionize.com, revolutionize with an S, and there's a page on there to, depending on how much you like Jeff Bezos, as to where you can buy it.
Super. Thank you very much. And everybody, if you want to come along to more events like this, please sign up to our newsletter. You can find out how to do that on our website, which is your-agenda.com. Thank you, everybody. I look forward to keeping in touch and watching your organizations grow into great organizations. I will see you all soon. Thank you very much.